Thank you, Karen. Thank you, Adam, for the opportunity to be a part of this. And a huge thanks, as Adam mentioned, to the entire Peterson team. I'm going to show you a lot of charts and other visuals, and it is largely because of them. So Alex, Sam, Jing, Christine, Melina, I could list hundreds of people. U.S. trade policy update, and please don't anybody check their phones for the next 10 minutes, and this will be accurate. After that, we'll have to update again, of course. Okay, so this is what we've basically done so far, right, or what we've seen so far, and I'm not going to go through it. You can click on our website, which provides an up-to-the-minute tracker. But initially, right, things started off very early, February 4th, 10% tariffs on China, March 4th, another 10% tariffs on China. The story back then was all about what was going on with Canada and Mexico, and those ultimately got kind of pulled back for the most part, but the tariffs on China remained. Then we saw tariffs on steel and aluminum going back on, a surprise announcement on autos that went on April 3rd, and then of course the actions, the reciprocal tariff, whatever we're going to call them, that was announced on April 2nd. 10% baseline on the world writ large, and then depending on who you were, and if you run a trade in goods surplus with the United States, you were going to get something on top of that, ranging from what would ultimately be 1% to 125%, as it would play out over the next few days. But then, of course, those were pulled back on April 9th, right? So a day or so into them actually being in place, President Trump was going to said he was going to put them on pause for 90 days, with the exceptions of the ones that had been put on China and that had subsequently increased from there. And then over the weekend, we saw, except there's going to be some carve-outs for certain products that contain semiconductors, so smartphones, laptops, things of that nature. Okay, so that's where we are as of today. And then we have more tariffs or implementation issues that are still coming. We've got the end of the de minimis program with respect to China that they said will go into effect on May 2nd. And then on May 3rd, we've got another round of 25% tariffs on auto parts going into effect. And then they've also signaled more tariffs are likely forthcoming. We've got national security Section 232 investigations on lumber and copper. You can tell that I made my chart last night before I saw that they have actually put forward the Section 232 investigations on pharmaceuticals and semiconductors. So we may see something there. We've got the secondary on secondary tariffs for Venezuelan oil, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Okay, so what does this mean? Well, a lot. So this is our, Karen already indicated, Doug Irwin and I are putting together some estimates of the current tariffs in a longer term historical context. So if we think of what we know at the moment, the tariffs this year might end up somewhere in the range of 15 to 20%, right? That's actually a really, really big number in historical context. Ones that we haven't seen here in the United States, since the 1930s. And these are numbers, average tariffs, import trade weighted average tariffs. So it's a really, really big number. The increase, the starting point being so extraordinarily low, as of January 20th, the tariffs were about 2.4%. So this is a really big increase in a very short period of time. There's a lot of new tariffs that are getting put on goods for which we've had zero tariffs for a very, very long time, typically because we don't make the stuff here. Suddenly those are going on as well. And then finally, we have a lot of cross-country differences. And the high end of those differences is this chart, which we do have a lot of different information or a lot of additional information on, which is the U.S.-China relationship. So here, let me just tell you what the current tariffs are, and then I'll tell you how we got there and why this is important. So as of right now, the U.S. average tariff on imports from China is about 124%. And the Chinese average tariff on stuff coming in from the United States is about 148%. Okay, now how did we get there? So first Trump administration, we started off, U.S. tariffs toward China were only about 3%. Tariffs China toward the U.S. were only about 8%. The course of the first trade war, right, the set of tariff actions between the two in 2018, 2019 raised those to about 20%. So for the United States, maybe a 16 percentage point increase that was implemented over 16 or 18 months. So yes, it covered a lot of trade. At the time, it was hugely consequential, but in the end, it was only increasing the average tariff by 16 percentage points. Here, we've gone from 20% to 124%. in less than 3 months, right? And now we're essentially covering everything that the United States imports from China. And back then, there were a lot of products that weren't covered, a lot of consumer-facing products. The Weekend Stories was all about, smartphones and laptops and all the things containing semiconductors that they dialed back the tariffs on. True, but the 20% tariffs that the administration imposed to the 10% of February 4th, March 4th, those are all still on. And tariffs did not go on those goods at all in the first administration. So there's a lot of consumer-facing goods imported from China that have never yet been hit with tariffs that we're going to see being hit this time around. And so this could lead to very, very different kinds of price outcomes and feeding into the sorts of economic indicators and performance that Karen already went through. The trading partner response thus far has been varied. Obviously, we've seen China announce tariff, and I just showed you the numbers, tariff retaliation of their own. Probably in terms of China's response, that's the least meaningful of what it is that they're doing. If you look at the data on what China imports from the United States, what the US exports to China, it hasn't really moved all that much since 2021, 2022, when China started resuming farm products, agricultural products, soybeans and things like that. They'd essentially stopped buying American automobiles. Airplane orders, never really recovered, right? The things that the manufactured goods the United States used to ship a lot to China never really came back. So additional tariffs aren't really going to be that meaningful, with the exception of the farm sector in the United States, which is still hugely dependent on China. Now, will they actually go through with it or not? How dependent is China on American soybeans, or can they get it from Brazil and alternatives? We'll have to wait probably until later in the year. October, November, December is when those goods are harvested, brought to market, shipped overseas. And so we have time. Maybe they'll come to some resolution before then. I'm not optimistic. But in any case, farm products is where the action is there. The bigger items are, and Adam mentioned this in a piece that he wrote either last week or the week before in Foreign Affairs. China's continuing on with its pattern of export restrictions in a lot of places where the United States is incredibly vulnerable. So you're thinking about things like critical minerals, raw materials, rare earths, where the United States is highly dependent on China. And it's been an area where for years now the United States has been doing creative policies to try to adjust those dependencies and move some of those supply chains. Hadn't happened yet. And so China's announced export restrictions. We'll see if they tighten those things up. And then they've done a number of other things to companies, new antitrust actions, sanctions, et cetera. For other countries, we're really waiting to see how it is that they're going to respond. The Canadians have announced, of all the other countries out there, tariffs in response to steel and aluminum and some of the other actions. But otherwise, countries that have traditionally responded with tariffs against the United States in these sorts of episodes, so the EU in particular, made an announcement of tariffs, but then put it on pause when President Trump said that he was going to pause his tariffs at the end of the week. So we're kind of in a wait-and-see mode with a lot of these other countries. Mexico has been very quiet in what their response is going to be as well. In terms of the economics, I'll be very quick here, and then we'll get back to the good stuff. What's going to be the impact here? We'll see. I want to give you a little bit of what we learned from the last time around and what we're expecting to look for in the data here. So if we remember, as Karen already indicated, there was a lot of front-running of trade in anticipation of these tariffs, right, after the election. And so we are going to see, you would expect to see a drop-off in trade flows, in the March and April data in all likelihood, even without the tariffs actually going on. So if you see a drop, which we will, we shouldn't overinterpret that as being, all entirely due to the tariffs, because it was expected to fall for other reasons. And then, of course, we could see trade volumes decline if the economy slows in the ways that Karen has indicated. Incidence of the tariffs, what's the tax burden expected to be? Well, the first time around with the Trump administration, most of the burden, the incidence of the tariffs fell on Americans, the American taxes. It was either the importers or retailers. Some were eventually passed along to the consumers, but there was very little evidence that these were passed through to foreign sellers, to say Chinese exporters. It could be different this time around. We'll have to wait and see. It is a different environment, but there was very little evidence of that the first time. And again, as I already mentioned, there's a lot of differences in terms of what the products are that are being impacted this time. A lot of first-time products that weren't hit last time. A lot of new countries. Obviously, the 10% tariff applies to everyone. There's a lot of new products that have never been hit before with these kinds of tariffs. And in some sense, supply can't respond everything everywhere all at once, despite what you see in the movies. Supply chains movements, well, after the first Trump trade war, 2018, 2019, eventually we did see some supply chains begin to move, the sort of China plus one, depending on the product. Maybe the final point of assembly would have moved out of China into a Vietnam or into a Taiwan or into a Mexico. Could this time be different for supply chains? Perhaps. It depends in part on what the administration's policy is going to be toward those other countries, and if it's also not going to be attractive to set up facilities there. So we're going to have to wait and see what they settle down with in terms of their tariff policy toward them. Obviously, there's really worrisome things happening in North America at the moment with the USMCA and what a USMCA compliant, non-compliant good is there, what the tariffs are ultimately going to be on Canada and Mexico, and especially for the just-in-time sort of supply chains in the automobile sector, especially. And so that's something to keep an eye on. And then as a final point here, the question of is the purpose of the policy to really try to target countries that run large bilateral surpluses with the United States? Well, if so, those surpluses are there partly for economic efficiency reasons. We know that overall deficits are a macroeconomic phenomenon, and so, in the absence of radical other sort of changes in the policy, those are likely to continue. And so it could just mean a reshuffling of who we have bilateral trade deficits with, depending on how it is that they impose these tariffs, and which could lead to a lot of efficiency implications for the U.S. economy as well. With that, I'll stop. Thank you.